Hello and welcome to Projector, and on this episode, Steve Coogan and director Michael Winterbottom re-team for the satire Greed. Richard McCready, played by Steve Coogan, is a hugely wealthy fashion magnate who owns the chain Monda, but his ruthless tactics bankrupted businesses and tax evasion has led to a tribunal and damaged his reputation. Writer Nick, played by David Mitchell, has been hired to do a book on McCready's life and invited to the Greek island of Mykonos, where Richard is arranging an elaborate star-studded Roman-themed 60th birthday party to try and rebuild his image no matter the cost. Greed is the latest collaboration between star Steve Coogan and director Michael Winterbottom, who will regularly work together. This is their 7th collaboration, including the Trip series, Tristram Shandy: A Cock and Bull Story, and 24-Hour Party People. This originally started out life as a Sacha Baron Cohen vehicle, but he dropped out of it, so Coogan stepped in to fill in the void. Although, ironically enough, Isla Fisher, Baron Cohen's wife, has a supporting role in this movie. The film very much takes aim at fast fashion and the whole culture that surrounds it, but specifically takes aim at Philip Green, who is the owner of UK high street chain Topshop, among many others, although it isn't just about him so much as the culture that he perpetuates, although a lot of McCready's behaviour in the movie is directly modelled on Green's own. It isn't that much of an exaggeration. So this is very much a film that is taken from the headlines and is very political, but in the guise of a comedy, but that's already landed in a bit of hot water. Winterbottom has made no secret about the fact that him and Sony butted heads, specifically over the fact the film ends with title cards explaining to us various statistics about inequality and about the fashion industry, and in the earlier versions of the film there is very much naming and shaming. Specific brand names were involved, as were celebrities, and obviously Sony making sure they didn't want to affect their relationships with those people and companies, asked Winterbottom to take them out and water it down. And that whole thing perhaps encapsulates Greed for me, in that while it does have big shiny teeth, it isn't all that cutting, and it does feel a little bit compromised in certain ways. If you were to look at the poster or trailer for Greed, you might get the mistaken impression that this is just another broad Steve Coogan comedy. It's not quite as simple as that. In fact, that's part of the problem. It feels very much like a hodgepodge, where it doesn't quite know what tone it wants to take. On the one hand, yes, it is that broad comedy, but on the other hand, it's also issue-tainment. And that's by design to a certain extent, in the filmmakers obviously wanted to address a challenging social issue, but do so in the guise of something mainstream and accessible, and that's very valiant and noble. I just don't think the movie entirely succeeds at that, and often it feels like the two sides of the movie are at war with itself. They never gel or blend together. Instead of the comedy revealing the message and vice versa, it feels like the movie stops the comedy to address what's at hand. And this is especially emphasised by the film's very structure, in that much of it takes place in Mykonos as McCready sets up this huge extravagant party, and this is where much of the comedy takes place. But then Nick goes and interviews people for his book, and then we get flashback to McCready's rise, and that includes scenes where he's in Sri Lankan sweatshops where they make the clothes, and really emphasises the staggering inequality on which he built his own empire. This is someone that made his success off of the back of factories that pay their workers £3.50 a day to make clothes with huge markups on them, and then someone like McCready is trying to push his margins up ever higher by paying less and less for more and more clothes. And while it gets passed on to us as consumers as cheaper fashion, there is also a human cost at the end of it, and that's what Greed is desperately trying to remind us, especially in the way it puts us at the forefront of the supply chain. And this is some of the most interesting material in the film, especially in the way it focuses on the practices of someone like McCready, not just in the fashion world, but financially as well. One of the best sequences in the film is someone explaining how when McCready made his chain private again, he had to buy all the public shares, and he did that by having a loan which went directly to him, but saddled the chain with the debt. He essentially used it as a way of making himself even richer, like a magic trick. And that's what this film is trying to say. For these kinds of people, it's all about accruing more and more wealth. It's all about the status symbols and everything that comes with it. As one character explains, he just loves money. It's not fashion he's in love with, that's just purely a way of making money that has worked for him because he knows how to exploit the supply chain in his favour. But because this movie tries to inspire such righteous anger, that also means that you feel less inclined to laugh at the comedy. And to a certain extent that is intentional, because Winterbottom is really trying to thrust your face in the vulgarity of it all, but it also creates this massive tonal dissonance as the movie snaps back and forth between these two modes. That's never clearer than a sequence where a group of Sri Lankan workers in an overcrowded factory are crushed when it collapses on top of them. I remember that happening years and years ago. That's inspired by an actual news event. But having that in your movie is so stark and powerful that I simply cannot go back to laughing at Coogan's exaggerated caricature again. And yes, while this movie is trying to hold the audience complicit in certain regards, I think that uncomfortable constant shifting of tone doesn't feel entirely intentional or assured, and certainly feels a bit graceless at times. This isn't helped by the fact the movie is unnecessary and ensemble and tries to tackle a whole range of subjects on the periphery when it would have benefited from a much more concentrated approach. For example, Sophie Cookson plays Macready's socialite daughter who appears on a reality TV show that's directed by Doctor Who's Paul Mackey, and that subplot is entirely unnecessary, and also saying that reality TV is staged and fake is not a very new observation. Likewise, Asa Butterfield plays Macready's son, who is deeply resentful of him, but does very little in the grand scheme of things up until the very ending, and it's a quite weak performance from him in general. There's also Syrian refugees on the beach, played by actual Syrian refugees, which tries to again reiterate the inequality of it all, but it also doesn't feel like it's naturally attached to what's going on in the narrative. It just feels like there's a lot of ideas here, but not a lot of cohesion. This is amplified by how they keep casting comedians in supporting roles that are especially recognisable if you're from the UK. Asim Chaudhry has a supporting role as a lion tamer because they hire a lion, which of course plays a key role in the proceedings. Likewise, Tim Key plays the frustrated overseer of the construction of this Roman Colosseum that Macready wants for the party. But having those people in those roles doesn't hide the fact that really it just isn't all that funny. That's where the main problem of Greed lies, in that yes, it can tackle this serious subject, but it doesn't really work entirely as entertainment. Most of the scenes in Mykonos are just bores. They're the characters lounging around in sun-kissed settings waiting for the party to happen, just as we are, whilst periodically noting how things are falling behind schedule. But the movie never takes advantage of that to its full comedic potential, and then once the party finally arrives, it's just a party. There's nothing particularly extravagant or excessive or outrageous about it to make it humorous. It just happens. And this is the backbone of the movie, and it falls totally flat. There are a couple of sparks of comedic invention. For example, the whole idea of the illusion of wealth and success is really hammered home by the idea of hiring celebrity lookalikes to fill in for guests who don't want to attend the party. Likewise, there's a lot of celebrity cameos to pay homage to the fact that Macready and his ilk want to associate with the rich and famous as well and try and bolster their image in that way. But the movie has these ideas but never expands upon them in a way that would actually make them pay off properly. They never feel fully developed. At least Steve Coogan does provide some laughs. Macready is right in his wheelhouse. He's pompous, pompous, arrogant, and image conscious, that's not exactly a stretch for Coogan to play, but he definitely revels in being the straw man. Greed has no interest in being subtle. After all, the character's named Rich, and the character's nicknamed Greedy McCready, in case you hadn't noticed. And Coogan devours into the part and the scenery with those blindingly white teeth. Many of the funniest moments in the film are him simply chewing out people in a volley of 4-letter words. He really seems to enjoy playing McCready as this odious bully. We genuinely love to hate him over the course of the film and really hope to see him find some sort of comeuppance. And certainly one of the better sequences in the film is a moment where he visits one of his less successful chains and decides to decorate the interior in fuchsia, which turns out to be a rather catastrophic mistake. That sequence shows how funny this film could have been in the right hands. The problem is that the movie never commits to having McCready as a central character. We only see him mostly in flashbacks up until the third act, and then it focuses on other members of the cast. And really, the movie would have been better served actually as a proper full mockumentary instead, really dedicating the first 2 acts to McCready's rise, and then having the whole party situation in the third act, instead of this back and forth structure. And you keep wishing that Coogan was around on screen more because he's the only part that's reliably funny. While David Mitchell is a hilarious comedian, he's been very ill-served by his rare film projects, and unfortunately that continues here, which is a real shame because his writer Nick is the closest thing this movie has to a protagonist, but he's just a cipher. He's someone who goes along from location to location to location just to forward the plot and have characters talk to him and reveal themselves to him. He's not especially interesting in his own right, and I know that's intentional. He's meant to be a bit feckless and clueless and out of his depth and doesn't really know what he's doing, but it honestly feels like the movie never exploits that fish out of water scenario to its proper comedic potential in a way that would benefit Mitchell, so mostly he just sits around being talked to and occasionally makes reference to how the events of the movie are very reminiscent and comparable to the fall of the Roman Empire, just in case you hadn't got the subtle symbolism that's going on here. Isla Fisher is amusing as McCready's ex-wife, but again, very limited screen time for her, and I don't understand why they decided to make her an ex-wife when McCready's current trophy wife is in the movie even less than she is. Why didn't you just combine those 2 characters into one instead of cluttering up the movie even further? Especially since they don't really act like they're all that separated throughout the entire narrative, although I will say that Fisher perhaps gets the best line of the movie with a rather juicy use of the C word. I just wish that again she was used more often. The tonal problems with Greed definitely come home to roost by time of the ending, where you realise that the entire movie has been building up to this one visual gag that is a literal representation of a common phrase that deserves to be in a much more absurd film than this one. Up until this point, Greed had been relatively grounded. It hadn't exaggerated that much for comic effect, so when this happens, it feels like a hard left turn into something far more absurd that the movie hasn't earned, especially because it's dealing with difficult social issues that it wants us to take seriously, and then something like that happens and it's completely farcical and ridiculous, and yet the movie also wants to bounce back into being serious directly afterwards because its final moments are surprisingly dark and bleak, and we get text captions about real life statistics after something like that happens. It really exemplifies how this movie feels completely all over the place because it neither commits to any approach. I support the message of Greed, but I don't like the execution. I think as a comedy, it just doesn't work. The gags aren't there, and it's nowhere near funny enough to make up for the darkness of its subject matter. And in the end, the 2 cancel each other out. They don't blend together, and they're individually weaker because of each other. This is a very weak outing for Coogan and Winterbottom, unfortunately, and in trying to make something that's accessible to a mainstream audience, they've created something unpalatable. At the end of Greed, there's something really unsatisfying about it, and I think the subject matter would have benefited better from perhaps being tackled in a much more straightforward way, even if it meant that it was catering towards a much smaller audience. It also doesn't help that Greed isn't as sharp or as incisive as it could be, not just because it's ill-disciplined and all over the place, but also because it tells us what we already know. A lot of Macready's antics are pretty much things that we've already seen Green do in real life, so there isn't that much exaggeration to it. It's a shame because the message about being more conscious about our choices, especially when it comes to retail, is a very important one, but do I think audiences are going to be coming out of this movie feeling changed? I don't buy it. Greed is a movie that is trying to disguise itself. This actually is a scathing critique of fast fashion and the culture of wealth hiding in the clothes of a Steve Coogan comedy. The problem is that the more serious political elements ripped straight from the headlines never gels together with broad humour, creating a very uneven tone that undermines both objectives. Coogan is deliciously vile when he gets the spotlight, another one of his self-absorbed narcissists, but the film needs to put him more at the forefront, and though David Mitchell can be hilarious, his writer makes for a boring, ineffectual protagonist. Simply put, it just isn't that funny, with only a scattering of laughs that the ensemble cast and cameos can't stir life into, and the commentary is too on the nose and aimed at obvious targets. This subject would have been better served as an actual documentary, but a comedy with an absurd ending that also challenges its audience's complicity is a tough pill that I doubt will have the effect that Winterbottom intends. If you like this review, then you can party over at my Patreon, where you can see my reviews early among other perks, including access to my Discord server, but until next time, I'm Matthew Buck, fading out.